A vacuum bleeder is an $80 accessory that creates a vacuum in the system, sucks out air pockets, and helps suck in coolant. Some people swear by vacuum bleeders and say they're absolutely necessary. Others swear by them not being necessary. The Boxster and Cayman have a valve built in, specifically designed for bleeding air from the system. And there are people out there, including myself, who have successfully filled and bled the coolant system with zero issues using the built-in bleeder. In this video, we're about to fill and bleed the coolant using the built-in bleeder without having to purchase a vacuum bleeder. I'm going to allude to using coolant to fill the coolant system, but the first time around that I did this, I used distilled water and filled the system with water the first time around, and did the whole procedure twice to also, while doing this, get all of my old coolant out. So when you hear coolant, you might want to use distilled water the first time around to fill and bleed your system. Later, we will drain it all and then do it again using real coolant. The procedure is simple. We will list the whole thing now to let you screenshot it, and then we show the procedure. I will also include this detailed guide in the description if you want to print the description out to have as a followable reference, because some of these steps move quickly. 1. Open the bleeder valve. To open the bleeder valve, remove the coolant cap, remove the oil cap, and remove the plastic panel underneath. Right after, reinstall the oil cap. Move this metal clip to the upwards position. This opens the bleeder valve. Get your Porsche OEM Coolant and mix it in a 1:1 ratio with distilled water. 1 gallon of coolant and 1 gallon of distilled water makes 2 gallons of usable coolant. The pink fluid prevents freezing and has other properties. If you add too much, it won't cool properly. If you add too little, you run the risk of your coolant freezing in the winter. Don't worry about super specific ratios. These mismatches only happen if the ratios are totally out of whack. With the coolant mixed, get a flashlight and shine it on the coolant level. It's a little hard to see. Add coolant to the reservoir until it's at the max line. You should hear it bubbling and you should hear air escaping. We're almost ready to start it and bleed the system. If you have a manual transmission, skip ahead to the next step. If you have an automatic transmission, you will need a digital tool to electronically disable the cooler shutoff valve. On the 986, we could have pulled fuse B1, but on the 987, this fuse is D5 and is used for other vital functions and should not be pulled. Therefore, we will need a video that demonstrates how to disable the valve electronically. Here is a video that demonstrates how to disable the valve electronically. Start the 987 and turn on the heat to the max level. While it's idling, keep adding coolant back to the max level until the level stops dropping. This takes a minute or two and a refill or two. Give it a few revs, not too much, and add coolant if the level drops, back to the max level. Close the coolant cap, but leave the bleeder valve open. What I found is particularly helpful to success in bleeding air from the system without a vacuum pump is parking on a steep hill. Find a steep hill and park the 987 with the rear up. The hill should be steep enough, such that the reservoir is above the radiators. That will help force the coolant in and air out of the radiators. This is not required but is strongly encouraged for a better bleed. If you're unable to find a steep hill, then I recommend bleeding the air once without a steep hill, following the procedure as written here, and then repeating the procedure once you find a hill. With the car in neutral, rev it to 2500 RPM for 10 minutes. Taking a break every 2 minutes to go back and check the coolant level is not below the minimum mark. If it is, add coolant by turning off the engine, waiting until the coolant cools down, and slowly and carefully remove the coolant cap and add coolant until the max line. If you don't wait long enough to open the cap and don't do it slowly, hot coolant can spray everywhere. While you're doing this, the temperature gauge should not exceed 180 and the heater vents should start blowing warm air, indicating there's coolant in the heater core. If the temperature gauge climbs too high, then you need more coolant or have too much air in the system. Assuming you reach the 10-minute mark successfully, rev it to 2500 RPM for another 5 minutes. During these 5 minutes, now we rev it briefly to 5000 RPM every 30 seconds. This will aggressively force the coolant through the system, in a good way, pressing out the air pockets. After the revving, turn the engine off and inspect the coolant level. Let it cool off and then carefully remove the cap and top off the coolant. Lower the bleeder valve and reinstall the plastic cover. Drive the car normally for 1 or 2 days and then check back in. Top off the coolant and you're good to go. If the temperature gauge reads too hot during driving, then repeat the bleeding procedure to get remaining air pockets out. It's not recommended to go on prolonged drives for a day or two after doing this, so you can get home easily if needed. I did this whole procedure twice, since my system was overdue for a coolant flush. First, I completely emptied the coolant system and the old coolant and filled and bled the system with distilled water, drove it for a bit, and then emptied the whole thing again and bled the system again, this time using the final coolant mix in a 1-to-1 ratio.